Yo, this is the Scarcity Studios YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And our sponsors at Alpha Claims and Hire Birmingham, the leading and best accident management company. Get a replacement car anywhere in 1 hour. The shooting of Anthony Grainger by armed police from Greater Manchester has been ruled as unlawful killing. This inquiry into his death, which took 7 years, it was released this year in July, and I have heard nothing about this. And it is little coverage in the news. So I went out of my way to go to the website for Anthony Grainger to acquire the results of the inquiry. And then I also referenced several newspapers, and I've shortened it down in order to try and explain it to you guys, to try and give you all the information and the facts so you can make up your mind as to what happened that day. This is Anthony's story. The village of Culcheth lies 6 miles northeast of Warrington, in the semi-rural area between Liverpool and Manchester, 10 miles east of Salford. It was in the Jackson Avenue car park that an authorised firearms officer of Greater Manchester Police, codenamed Q9, shot and killed Anthony Grainger on the evening of Saturday the 3rd of March 2012. Mr. Grainger was 36 years old. He was sitting in the driver's seat of a stolen Audi. There was 2 other men in the car with him. The front passenger was David Totten. A man called Joseph Travers was in the back. All 3 of them was from the Salford area. None of them had any connection to Culcheth. The Audi had been stolen some weeks earlier and was displaying false number plates. In October 2011, Greater Manchester Police set up an investigation called Operation Shire, the purpose of which was to look into the activities of organised crime groups based in Salford. One of Operation Shire's subjects was David Totten, a professional criminal, they described him as, of considerable notoriety. Many years earlier, he had survived an attempted assassination in the Brass Handles pub in Salford, during the course of which his 2 assailants were shot dead. Bobby Spears was convicted of this. He was convicted for trying to kill his rival in an attack that terrored customers in a pub. The court heard that a security firm owner organised and calculated a planned attempted gangland execution from the safety of a football stadium. Bobby Spears, 41, thought he had the perfect alibi as he sat during a match in the executive box at Old Trafford, Manchester, but the gangland killing attempt by 2 men at the Brass Handles pub Salford during a Sunday afternoon match in 2006 went wrong when one of the attackers' weapons jammed and both of the gunmen were attacked and killed.
It's believed they were overpowered once inside the pub. Their bodies were found yards from the scene with bullet wounds in their chests. The pub has never reopened since that day. It's not known for certain exactly what happened inside. The pub was packed at the time of the shooting, but no witnesses have come forward, and evidence including CCTV footage has never been found.
Mobile phone traffic linked Spears to the murder, and he aroused suspicion as he fled the country within days of the murders. Bobby Spears was convicted of conspiracy to murder following a 3-week trial and jailed for a minimum of 23 years. The court heard that drinkers fled the pub. Carlton Alva Ragnar and Richard Austin burst in brandishing handguns. Their target was David Totten. He was at the table drinking. He was hit with another man. Aaron Travers was also shot, but Carlton's gun jammed. The gunman had got jumped, and at this point there was disarmed. A known Moss Side gangster was in the pub and suspected of the shooting before they was carried outside and beaten while they was dying. David Totten and Travers were seriously injured but survived. They refused to cooperate with the police. It is believed the planned murders were arranged because Spears had lost face, otherwise been embarrassed by Totten over admission to a nightclub.
From London to Manny, we get tons of the Cali. And you know we shotting them when we up in Nottingham, serving up the addicts, Birmingham and back it, swerving in the traffic, burn it then I rap it. Yo, when I'm in Derby, no less than a half key. If I'm in Bradford, I'm licking out a Jarby. When we in Ealing, I tell you about the meaning. Me and my packies, we stacking higher to the ceiling.
Police believed that he had installed the help of Ian McLeod, a boss of a notorious Manchester Doddington gang who provided the manpower. He was also jailed for life with a 21-year minimum, so that gives you an idea of who David Totten was to the police. Anticipating that robbery might take place the next day, Detective Inspector Robert Coulson set up a surveillance operation and secured the assistance of Mobile Armed Support Surveillance Team. Earlier on in the evening on Saturday the 3rd of March, the stolen Audi travelled travelled to Culcheth. Mr. Grainger reversed into a corner space commanding a view of the entire car park. Shortly after 7 p.m, firearms commanders in charge of the mass team decided to arrest the men in the Audi. It was during that operation that an officer known as Q9 discharged a single round from his carbine through the Audi windscreen, hitting Mr. Grainger in the chest and killing him. The 3 men in the Audi turned out to be wearing gloves, and 2 of the men were wearing hats that if you rolled them down could form a face mask. The investigators later found a 3rd hat in another footwell. No firearms or other weapons were found at the scene, and a subsequent search of the men's homes. In September 2012, David Totten, Mr. Travers and Mr. Rimmer appeared for trial at Manchester Crown Court on a charge of conspiracy to rob. At the outset of the hearing, the defendants offered to admit conspiracy to steal cars, but they refused that offer, took them to trial, and they was acquitted. So this was after Anthony Grainger was killed. On the 27th of June 2013, they produced the final investigation report into what happened, and they said there were serious failings and briefings into the intelligence of the firearms officers that resulted in the death of Anthony Grainger. The report also criticised the planning, tactics and options for use of force, combined with the CS gas they dispersed and also blew out the tyres with shotgun shells. So how on earth did Anthony Grainger come to be in this car park? How did this all happen? And this is all referenced from the inquiry, so I'll leave a link, but it is 400 pages long, so be prepared for a big read. But this is just a brief summary of that with a mix of the other. In December, unknown thieves stole an Audi from Bolton. Officers later found the Audi in Salford displaying false registration plates and fitted it with covert tracking equipment to allow them to monitor its movements. In January of 2012, the investigators added Mr. Grainger as a subject of the Operation Shire. They took a previous intelligence profile from a different case on Mr. Grainger and adopted it to an existing one. Officer Q9, who was the one that shot him, had been on duty for almost 14 hours, and they ruled in the inquiry that was excessive, and he was unable to exclude the possibility that fatigue had affected him and degraded his ability to make accurate decisions in a critical situation. The use of tyre breaching rounds to disable the stolen Audi was deemed unnecessary and inherently dangerous in that it exposed officers and subject them to risk of injury from shrapnel. Greater Manchester Police pronounced the CS gas dispersal on the 3rd of March 2012 in flagrant breach of the codes of police uses of firearms and lethal weapons. Some of the officers who commanded or participated in the operation, including the tactical firearms officer himself, lacked the requisite level of professional competence. Mark Granby had failed recently a specialist police service of Northern Ireland Joint Services training course before allowing Superintendent Grady to resume tactical command roles. Greater Manchester Police should have considered whether to remove him from firearm command responsibilities pending further assessment of his operational competence, but they did not do this. X7 was the leading officer out of all the armed police that attended that day. He didn't attend a refresher course that was mandatory for all officers, and that was a counter-terrorist specialist firearms course. So basically, at least 2 of these officers were not actually fit to be on duty on that day. The court investigation team comprised of 5 officers from Greater Manchester's robbery force. At the head of it was D.I. Coulson, whose deputy sergeant was Detective Sergeant Deborah HURST. Detective Constable Gary Mills was the exhibits officer. They performed an array of tasks that nominated disclosure officers and an intelligence officer and the handling of telephone evidence. D.I. Coulson ran the investigation and set the tone of the investigation. He was the one who briefed the firearm commanders when the need arose, and he was an important witness who spent 4 days giving evidence in the inquiry. The initial investigation of Operation Shire was into a totally different crime family, the Culcheths, that was associating with David Houghton. They believed that it was later proven they hadn't been associating with each other. Anthony Grainger did not become a subject of the operation until late in January. He was assigned the code name Gloucester. Most of the background information which was later used to brief the firearms officers came from subject profiles prepared by intelligence officers. A subject profile provides an intelligence-based portrait of a specific individual. They relied heavily on police warning markers and signals that was on the PNC, which is their database, and the Opus database, which is where they don't even have to arrest you or charge you to get information to put on there. They can just put a marker on your name anyway. And it gets even more complicated because the file they gave to the officer that was in charge of Shire was from a totally different operation called Samana. It was a sensitive investigation into the theft of a digital memory stick that belonged to an officer of the Greater Manchester Police. This was said to contain very delicate information on sources. So for example, snitches, grasses, informants to the police. And somebody broke into this officer's house and actually stole it. And they actually approached Anthony Grainger during this investigation and they believed that he may have done it. But then they later dropped that. He hadn't been in trouble with the police for over 15 years. They then received intelligence that David Totham was about to commit a robbery. At 8:45, the Audi turned into Jackson Avenue in the public car park and reversed into the parking bay by the far end of the road that Mr. Grainger was right hand side. The Audi was occupied in the corner space, the vehicle and its occupants directly facing onto Thompson Avenue. During the period of observation, nobody got out that vehicle, and D.I. Coulson was actually on a balcony of a house. He decided to move because he thought he might be compromised because he was overlooking them. So for 15 minutes, they didn't have any visual contact on the car. They said that the Operation Shire's commanders had become obsessed with a robbery occurring on the 3rd, and it was obvious after 7 o'clock, none of the targets would have been viable to have been hit. There was no way that they was going to commit any robbery because none of the shops was open that they potentially would have targeted. There was no video or sound recording of any of the events that took place that day. And on the 3rd of March, the communications between the officers during the event phase was very secretive. So the only way this inquiry could try and find out what had happened was by using the evidence provided by the police. There was 4 cars occupied by armed officers. Everybody except for officers X9 and Z15 were in charge of special munitions. Each of the armed officers were armed Heckler & Koch MP5 carbine and holstered self-loading pistol, each with 30 rounds of ammunition, a taser with 3 cartridges in accordance with that morning's briefing. X9 was at the rear side in Bravo and Z15 the rear side in Charlie. They carried a shotgun containing special breaching rounds that was called ram rounds, and also the CS gas which was used, and a window breaking hammer X7 had carried. In a witness statement by X7, who was the leader of the operation, said, at approximately 7 o'clock I received a phone call. Superintendent Granby. As a result of the conversation, I mobilised the 3 remaining units on Warrington Road and remained on the road until he told me to state amber. X7 then gave evidence that this gave him clear control of the operation from this point on. According to X7, it was the convoy approaching the mini roundabout that he placed the team on state red. It is not possible to fix the precise moments at which he did so. They would not have had more than 200 yards till they have got to their destination when they went into code red. During this stage of the operation, because what you have to understand with an inquiry is they treat the police like it's the only time they ever treat the police like criminals. They actually interview them under caution, they investigate their phone records, everything. And one of the detectives in the case, HURST, conducted a number of telephone conversations with D.I. Coulson, who she made no note of, and she made a phone call she couldn't tell the inquiry about. They said they found it disturbing that during the critical strike phase of the operation, when her mind should have been on the task in hand, she was conducting a personal conversation with Detective Anthony Grainger, whom she considered a close friend. He was D.I. Coulson's line manager. He was not part of the Operation Shire investigation team. D.S. Hurst admitted none of the many messages that she exchanged with Detective Grainger had any connection with the work or either participant. I reject her claim that the private conversation did not clash with her abilities to focus on her work. In the course of her working shift on the 3rd of March 2010, she sent no fewer than 46 text messages to Detective Grainger. During the same period of time, Detective Grainger sent 48 text messages to D.S. Hurst. Hurst allowed herself to be distracted by purely personal matters at a critical stage of events that she should have been devoting her full attention to the events unfolding in Culcheth. While there was no evidence to suggest that her lack of concentration contributed to the outcome of events, it was nonetheless deplorable casual approach to her responsibilities as a deputy. X7 told the inquiry he said the plan was a simple one. The officers from Alpha would take the driver's side of the Audi. Those from Bravo would take the passenger side, but the officers in the remaining 2 cars would fill in if necessary. He insisted that he had broadcast the plan to other vehicles in the team of his initial account, which he provided hours after the incident. It gives the impression that only the last moment the convoy convoy had been told about this. However, the plan underwent a last-minute modification. It was while they was pulling into the car park, broadcasting his instructions, that X7 heard Q9 offer to cover the stolen vehicle from his position in the back of the Alpha. In his own statement dated 9th of March 2012, Q9 confirmed that he'd made a suggestion of a police convoy while they was approaching the car park, adding that the officer in Alpha agreed with it. Officers were right to do so at the last stage, as it was a matter that Q9's proposal represented a significant departure from the standard approach. They did not tell the rest of the team of Q9's intentions. X7 said to the inquiry, Bravo and Charlie vehicles are closely followed by Alpha. Bravo was less than 10 yards behind Alpha. The stolen Audi was effectively boxed in. Close to its offside was the tall hedge, which I have already referred to. Immediately behind it was a narrow strip of grass, behind which was a low wall and a high fence. The parking bay adjacent to the Audi on the near side was vacant, but the next space was occupied by a green car. Alpha was on the broadside to it, in contact with it, the front of the Audi with its bonnet very close to the tall hedge. There was only 3 witnesses that can describe the circumstances of the fatal shot, namely the police officer Q9, W4, and Mr. David Totten, who was sitting next to Mr. Grainger in the front passenger seat of the stolen Audi. They said that Mr. Totten was a thoroughly unreliable witness. He undoubtedly tried to mislead the inquiry in certain aspects of the evidence, although his description of the arrest phase is broadly consistent with the evidence available from other sources. Mr. Totten told the inquiry that Q9's shot came through the windscreen of the stolen Audi as soon as the Alpha vehicle pulled up. He said he saw a bright torch shining into the interior of the Audi from the back of the Alpha, but he did not hear any warning or challenge before the shot. He heard what he described as a crackle and felt shards of glass hitting his head. He claimed in a split of a second as if the car had come to a stop. As soon as he heard the shot, Mr. Totten looked at Mr. Grainger, who was still sitting in the driver's seat, and then within a split second of that he opened the passenger door with his right hand and got out of the Audi. Attempting to scramble behind the back of the car, he slipped and lost his footing. Armed police restrained him and arrested him with his face down. He heard 2 loud bangs, he said, while he was laying on the floor, and the reports of the shotgun shooting out the tyres. Mr. David Totten did not hear any glass breaking at that point, and he was not aware of any CS gas that was deployed. He said there was no gas in the vehicle while he was inside. Q9 discharged his carbine within 3 to 4 seconds of Alpha coming to a stop. Both officers told the inquiry that Q9 had shouted the challenge, "Armed police, show me your hands," beforehand. As soon as the vehicle stopped, the occupants of the Audi initially put their hands up, but Mr. Grainger suddenly and deliberately, as Q9 says, lowered his right hand and his left hand out of the officer's view. And when he saw the officers going near the stolen car at the time, and the evidence clearly demonstrated he fired his weapon before any of them had reached it. The nearest that was there was W9. He told the inquiry he just got to Alpha's boot on the way to the Audi, estimated it had taken him 3 seconds to get to the boot after the car had halted, at which time Bravo was still in the process of coming to a stop. He heard someone shout, "Armed police, show me your hands," and he estimated that the sound of the shot followed within a couple of seconds of that challenge. X7 described hearing a bang, which he thought was likely to have been the sound of the Q9's shot. In his witness statement dated the 9th of March 2012, he said that he had heard the bang as he ran past Alpha. Mr. Grainger had been shot by the time X7 had reached him. However, because he was still conscious, not realising that Mr. Grainger was injured, X7 pointed his gun at him and shouted, "Armed police, show me your hands." Anthony turned his head slightly, looked directly at the officer and raised both hands. X7 continued to shout instructions at Mr. Grainger, telling him to keep his hands where they were. Moments later, however, the gas went off in the car and Mr. Grainger reacted by flinching slightly to this. X7 described this as an involuntary twitch of the head, and very slowly he lowered his hands to his knees out of sight. Fearing that he might be about to drive the car, X7 struck him on the right arm with the muzzle of his carbine while shouting at him to keep his hands up. The officer explained that although the possibility that Mr. Grainger might be reaching for a weapon had crossed his mind, he did not believe it necessary to shoot him because he could not see the weapon. And that is when Mr. Grainger slumped over. X7 saw his eyes roll back into his head. Under pressure from a QC during the investigation, X7 appeared to concede that he had seen Mr. Grainger raise his hands above his head to his upper chest, which should have been visible to Q9. So that's what he says. Mr. Grainger's left arm fell across the centre console and fell back into the seat. It was at that point that Officer U2 heard one of his colleagues shout, "He's been shot, he's been shot." Together with a colleague, they unsuccessfully attempted to remove Grainger from the Audi by pulling him through the driver windows. When U2 suggested extracting him through the open rear door instead, they noticed blood on the chest area of Mr. Grainger's t-shirt, and they made their way around the back of the Audi. Having checked there was no one in the boot, they then gave him emergency treatment. So they shot him, and then they threw the CS gas in there, and then they shot the tyres out as well. So this all happened after Anthony was shot. And at this point is the only point during the investigation that H9, the officer coded H9, noticed that the stolen Audi's radio was playing at the time. So when these police had pulled up and shouted their demands, Anthony would not probably have been able to hear them very clearly anyway. Another thing that the inquiry pointed out is that the officers conferred with each other afterwards. 5 days after the shooting of Anthony Grainger, they all went to Nexus House and they all sat with each other and wrote statements, but they did a flip chart where they had several things that the leading officer J4 at the time, that was his code name, claimed were facts. These facts were actually not even factual. Various details were misleading and the registration plate of the car at the time was not even accurate. Several of the officers in the case said that this flip chart where they was told what to say made them feel a bit uncomfortable and they didn't even listen to the flip chart. So it goes to show that the police was actually encouraging them to write a certain type of statement. The other operation, Operation Samana, which was the one that Anthony Grainger was suspected of, which was the theft of the USB that involved delicate information on intelligence, they said, which people have alleged means that it's informants. It was stolen from the officer's house in July 2011, so this was a year before Anthony was killed. The officer concerned had sensitive data, which was significant risk to certain named individuals. The officer kept the device in his wallet, and on the evening of the 17th of July, he left his wallet in his kitchen at his home and his keys to the car, which was parked on a drive outside. An intruder entered the kitchen through an unlocked door and stole the wallet and the car keys, using the keys to steal the car. The officer's use of the memory stick to store sensitive official data was unauthorised and unlikely to have been known by the officials. The burglary took place in the early evening, and while the officer was at home, everything about the crime suggests it was opportunistic and that the theft of the wallet containing the memory stick was not the actual direct thing that they wanted to get. Even so, they actually made the operation to just find this memory stick. That's how important this memory stick was. In their efforts to find the missing device, investigators conducted thorough inquiries. They learned that an airbag that originated from the stolen vehicle was sold to a car breaker's business in Radcliffe. The proprietor of the business was a man called Colin Waters, who lived at the same address as Mr. Grainger. The police arrested both men and searched the buildings that they were thought to be linked to. In the event, the investigation disclosed no evidence. The memory stick was never recovered, and no information or intelligence suggests that unauthorised persons had access to its contents. They didn't take any further action against Anthony Grainger in that actual case. His family did say in a statement by his lawyer that it may have had something to do with the memory card, the USB. The first person to be punished initially is Stephen Haywood, the Assistant Chief Constable of Manchester Police. He was charged with gross misconduct at the end of the hearing because he made notes after the death of Anthony Grainger and made a false impression that he'd actually made them before. So that is a brief summary of the inquiry. As I said, I'll leave a link to the full version if you want to go and read that. I think it's very interesting to see to the extent of the amount of mistakes that was made, the amount of negligence and the amount of just general terrible operation that this turned out to be, that resulted unnecessarily in the death of Anthony Grainger. So I want to send my condolences to the family of Anthony Grainger. I wish them all the best for the future. So I really appreciate you joining me today. Please don't forget to leave a comment, pay your respects to Anthony Grainger, and don't forget to leave some feedback as well. Thank you. Peace.